Hi, everyone. Our topic of discussion for the Teach Back assignment is the two-row wampum belt. This presentation was done by Group 2, who includes Claire, Julia, Eli, Burke, Mackenzie, and April.
The two-row wampum belt is an artifact that is used to symbolize the coming together of two people, the Haudenosaunee and the Dutch. It was created between these two nations in 1613, and it was created as an agreement made between the two parties on how they would treat one another and live together. The belt has two purple beaded rows made from wampum shells running along it to represent two boats. One boat is the canoe with the Haudenosaunee way of life, laws, and people, and the other is a Dutch ship with their laws, religion, and people. These two boats will travel side by side down the river of life. The three white rows on the belt represent three different things. Firstly, friendship. The Haudenosaunee and their white brothers will live in friendship. Secondly, peace. There will be peace between the two people. And lastly, forever. This agreement will last forever.
Important dates and places in relation to the two-row wampum. Turtle Island is a name used by many indigenous nations which refers to what is now commonly known as North America. This name comes from the rich oral tradition of storytelling, which describes the continent as once being carried on a turtle's back. New Netherlands, which contained modern-day Albany, was the settlement established by Dutch colonizers in the 17th century. What is now known as Albany was the place where the two-row wampum treaty was created and where the Haudenosaunee and Dutch people built a relationship. In 1613, this was the year of the initial agreement between First Nations people and European colonizers. The two-row wampum acted as a mutual agreement for many years until 1664, when the Dutch finally surrendered to the British. Even though the Dutch had surrendered to the British, the two-row wampum still led the relationship between First Nations and settlers. It was not until 1764 when the British and the Haudenosaunee formed a formal relationship, which followed in the footsteps of the two-row wampum. The two-row wampum is still very relevant today, and in 2013 was celebrated after its 400th year anniversary.
The parties involved in the two-row wampum belt are the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Dutch settlers. At the time of the two-row wampum agreement, the Haudenosaunee, meaning people of the Longhouse, also known as the Iroquois League or League of the Five Nations, consisted of the Seneca, Cayuga, Oneida, Onondaga, and Mohawk nations. Today, the Haudenosaunee are commonly known as Iroquois or the Six Nations, as the Tuscarora Nation joined the Confederacy in 1722. The image shown on the right side of the slide is of the Six Nations Iroquois chiefs explaining the wampum belts they were preserving in 1871.
What is the cultural context? According to the Onondaga Nation, the main thing that was meant to be accomplished through the making of this wampum belt and the agreement it symbolized was a relationship of friendship and peace, a relationship where both parties could be civil without trying to direct one another's way of life. Some social context. The Dutch settlers first viewed the Haudenosaunee peoples as childlike or inferior in some way. When coming up with a greeting to be used between the two parties, the Dutch said that they should be called father, while the Haudenosaunee were sons. The Haudenosaunee instead insisted that they call each other brother, so that they would be equals. The Onondaga Nation says that the way each of the two cultures symbolized their peace agreement was also significant. The Dutch used paper documents and silver chains which would not break down like iron would. At each meeting between the Dutch and the Haudenosaunee, the chains could be polished. This symbolized that they wanted this friendship to last. For the Haudenosaunee, symbolism of this friendship came in the form of a wampum belt. The belts were used to mark agreements between peoples by many indigenous cultures, as well as to record history. According to the Onondaga Nation, the belt depicts two ships, one signifying the Dutch, the other the Haudenosaunee. These ships are parallel, meaning that they do not interfere in the other's way of life, but travel side by side. Further historical and political context. The two-row wampum belt was very politically significant as well, because it symbolized the beginning of an alliance between the Dutch and Haudenosaunee peoples. It was similar to the signing of a treaty, with some other examples being the Hiawatha Belt, which depicted the uniting of the Haudenosaunee peoples, and the George Washington Belt, which depicted the Canandaigua Treaty between the Haudenosaunee and the United States. The peace treaty represented by the Two-Row Wampum, according to Onondaga Nation, is still very much considered to be a living treaty by the Haudenosaunee peoples, who hope that it can continue to be honored when resolving issues going forward.
The Two-Row Wampum Belt was intended to guide peaceful and friendly coexistence with their Europeans by recognizing each other as equals. This way, Indigenous people could preserve their way of life and welcome the Europeans on their lands. For a short period of time, this was positive for the well-being of the Indigenous people as they were simply working together. However, it did not stay this way. Eventually, Europeans began colonizing and imposing their way of life on the Indigenous people, disregarding the valuable agreement that was made to coexist peacefully with each other. Indigenous lands were taken without permission, trade routes, cultural practices, traditional medicines, etc., were affected by the white supremacy ideologies. The well-being of Indigenous people was heavily affected as they were no longer being viewed as equals and treated poorly as they were viewed as lesser. The systemic inequalities caused poverty and problems in the healthcare system, which made the spread of diseases like tuberculosis a huge problem. Issues with healthcare, like the spread of TB, are still present today because of these inequalities and complications in providing adequate healthcare in Indigenous communities.
What are the ongoing impacts? Today, many of the wampum belts have been lost, sold to private studios, buried alongside the dead, or they remain in the community they are culturally significant in. The ongoing impact of these failed agreements is 40% of Indigenous children live below the poverty line, and Indigenous peoples face almost twice the mortality rate than a non-Indigenous person. Scholars conclude that the Two-Row Wampum Belt is critical in improving health in Indigenous communities. To eliminate disease and illness, the colonial social structure forced onto the Indigenous peoples, we must use the Two-Row Wampum Belt to show our lifelong agreement to the First Peoples. We must show how the one side of the wampum belt is meant to show the Indigenous peoples' health and their relations to Canada, and the colonial structure and the settlers' health and relations to Canada.